Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Web Behind. Today with me I have Adrian Bettridge-Weesey from Two Wave. Hey Adrian.
Howdy.
Thanks so much for being on with me.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh yeah, of course. Maybe we could start off a little bit just talking about what you're currently up to, what kind of stuff you work on, and what you do for your job.
Sure. So I am the Chief Operations Officer of Two Wave. We're a software consulting firm based in Champaign, Illinois, which is basically the center of the state, which people from Chicago would call Southern Illinois, but really is about dead center. It's home of the University of Illinois, and it's actually a pretty big tech hub. We have like Yahoo here, John Deere, which is not exciting to some people, but actually is a giant tech company, as well as Wolfram Research, if you're familiar with Mathematica. So it's pretty thriving. I mean, we're home of the NCSA, National Center for Supercomputing Applications, and then they've got the Blue Waters petascale supercomputer here. So it's a pretty neat tech town.
Awesome.
And so we're not a very big consulting firm, and my role of Chief Operations Officer is expansive. So I do boring stuff like pay the bills. I do fun stuff like write proposals. So I'm basically our sort of chief proposal writer. And then I accidentally became kind of our front end guy too. So when we have front end development that needs done, I usually do it. I don't do the design. We have a separate designer that we work with, but the actual implementation is I've sort of, like I said, accidentally ended up being the guy that does that. And so, yeah, it's a pretty neat gig, given that I get to do a bit of everything. And we're a pretty widely distributed company, too. So a lot of days I just work from home. We've got employees in Jamaica and Argentina. We've got a guy in Cleveland. And then the sort of central Illinois component is myself, one developer who lives about 20 minutes away. And then actually my father, who owns the company, is our president.
Awesome. Cool. So what kind of stuff do you work on? Like what kind of job
Well,
do you take?
yeah, so our big thing is real-time web. And we use the Meteor framework, which if you're familiar with it, it's a pretty awesome framework for real-time web. And it happens to be a really, in our minds at least, like one of the easiest ways to get started with ECMA 2015 or whatever they're calling it this week. Because it comes with Babel built in, and they've just got a really great framework for that. So that's really nice to work with. But again, the real timiness, I guess, I should say, is sort of the thing that drew us to it. And we've been working with it for a long time, since like Meteor 0.5 or something. And right now, our big client is using Meteor to develop a enterprise scale Internet of Things platform, which I haven't been able to talk about for years, but finally can. And it's really actually super cool. Our client makes these little hardware gateways that they've got wireless, usually like cellular internet or Wi-Fi Ethernet cards in them for connectivity. And then they've got Z-Wave or Zigbee or other device control chips in them. And then they've built with a good friend of ours, John Fairweather, who is a literal rocket scientist, built a custom programming language to control these devices, which allows for cross-platform and cross-protocol control. And then we built this real-time web interface, so you can control and script your devices. You can watch them behave in real time, and it's lightning fast from time that a device changes to time that you see it change in your browser. It's not instantaneous, but it is way faster than you'd expect the internet to be able to behave. So that's been our big thing. We also do, we're consulting contractors, so whoever wants to pay us, we'll do it, right? So we have some really fun stuff that we've done with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources around educational sites. So we built a really cool interactive educational site about white-tailed deer, which are depending on who you talk to, either a massive nuisance or less of a nuisance, but still a nuisance. They're just, it's the sort of archetypical central Illinois problem. But deer is actually a big deal here. And so we built them a site. It's an educational website, and it's got a whole back end that they build with actually Adobe Dreamweaver rather than having to cook them a WYSIWYG editor. So they use Dreamweaver and Upload, and the application, it's actually a Meteor application as well, just parses the file tree and build a website out using the directory structure.
Cool.
Yeah, and we've done some other fun stuff. We've worked with Public Art League here in town to build a interactive, location-aware application for their outdoor sculptures. So somebody can pull up the app on their phone and see the nearest sculpture, go to it, give their impressions of it, and it sort of builds into a whole crowd thing. Um, we've built a lot of stuff. We have a pretty cool cybersecurity product that we worked on for a while with a company called Mach 1 Development, which is like a Windows kernel application as well as a whole web interface. So it tracks everything that happens to a document throughout its entire lifespan in a system. We basically do a little bit of everything. Any technology that needs to be built, we can do it. We've got a pretty wide range of skills on our team, which is fun for us, right? So we're not just a Meteor shop. We're not just a WordPress shop, for example. Um, Generally, when we get a project come in, somebody on our team will be an expert, or at least pretty close to an expert on it, and we'll have them go off and build it. So it's a really fun. Sorry, I just got attacked by a cat. Um, there we go. So it's a really fun life, actually, for all of us to get to sort of build these things. And while, like, our Internet of Things application, now we've been working with the company for years. A lot of these things are, 6 to 8 month projects that we do with them. So we get to do a lot of cool things, and we get to tend to cycle through a lot.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really great. So how long, coming a little bit back in time, how long have you been doing programming tech stuff?
Um, well, in an official capacity, it's sort of a hard question to answer. So I
Yeah.
grew up. I mean, I grew up in a pretty geeky household, right? So my father has been actually he started as a home builder when I was younger, and I got to rewind there. So when he was really young, he worked on Play-Doh, which was one of the sort of first really networked computer instances. And so he was programming on Play-Doh when he was a teenager. Then he built houses for a while. He got really big into sort of smart homes back in the 90s. So back before smart homes were really
Not
taking
so
off.
smart homes.
Well, it's sort of amazing how smart they actually were. But it was a lot of stuff with like clever wires running to big control boxes so that you could point, your remote at an outlet and it would route the IR signal all the way back to your controller, right? That sort of thing. He got out of the housing market, the housing building market, when it sort of collapsed in the 90s. And he sort of got into programming. And so he was a programmer. He's always been a programmer, but he became a professional programmer then. So I grew up around it, but I was a pretty rebellious kid. So I did my very best not to learn anything about programming, which didn't work as well as I thought. But so I actually, I was a musician. And so I studied music in undergrad. And so I guess we'll rewind to all the things that I've not been good at before I got to this job. But really, I didn't do much tech work until my last job, which was at an academic publishing company. And they have a piece of educational software that they were building. And I was sort of in charge of customer support for that among my many duties there. And that included a lot of sort of working with the engineers, filing bugs, that sort of thing. I've had sort of tangential work that I've done for myself, internet-wise, generally for my role-playing game campaigns. So that's really how I learned to build websites, was just working on my sort of whatever game we were playing. I'd build them a website. And every time I wanted to do something, I would have to find somebody who could tell me how to do it. And I built actually a pretty good set of skills just doing that before I was even officially working in tech.
So was that your kind of first foray into any kind of, I mean, it sounds like you had like some programming experience, right, from your dad. Was that your like first taste of programming, was stuff he was doing?
Yeah, so I don't even know if that qualifies as a taste. That was me looking at it and doing my very best not to learn what it was.
Uh-huh.
I was not a good kid, honestly. But so yeah, my first real foray into actual programming was building websites for myself and my
And
friends.
how long ago did you start that? Like when was the kind of maybe your first one or first couple?
Well, my first one was probably in high school, and it was bad. Right, I'm glad that I can't find it. But it was really sort of like mid undergrad or maybe late undergrad that I started getting more involved in just like building these cool things for my own entertainment. Um, and so that was, how old am I now? That was probably like 2008, 2007, 2008. That I did like low tech, just HTML and CSS and some JavaScript that I ripped off of people for click effects or something, right?
Right.
And then it was 2014 or so that I started getting ambitious enough to build bigger things. And then I just happened to be pretty good at wrapping my head around that stuff. And so I ended up taking over that role at Two Wave, and then just keep learning more. Every time you learn more, you realize how bad you are at everything. But the websites we make work, and I try not to spend too much time off the clock fixing my embarrassing stuff, a year later. But that's essentially it. I'm almost entirely self-taught, in terms of like I've never taken a single class on any of that. I've had some great teachers just because I've had access to really good engineers. First, in my last job, who I could just sort of learn about technology from them. And then also I've had access to my dad once I was mature enough to listen to him. And then the engineers that I work with now, who are really good at helping me figure out like when I'm being really dumb. But I've also got a really nice network, extended network of tech people that I've built here in town, and many of my friends from just growing up happen to work in tech now. So I can say like, hey, have you ever run into this issue or something? But that's basically how I got into tech, was teaching myself.
Cool. So, what your first time doing these websites, kind of back in what did you say, like 2008, something like that, just the HTML, CSS websites.
Yeah, something like that.
What was it? What was the landscape like as far as you teaching yourself? Do you remember like what tools you were using or what sites were big for you back then?
Wow, that's a great question. I used text edit, right? So I've been a Mac guy for a while. I built my sites in text edit for a long time, and then Notepad plus plus or something. There's no TextMate. TextMate was what I graduated to, from text edit to TextMate. And boy, syntax highlighting, it blew my mind. I don't use TextMate anymore. But so, that was basically the tool. And then, trying furiously to Google for my answers. And well, Stack Overflow / Stack Exchange or whatever it is these days wasn't nearly as big back then. But, there were still lots of resources for people just trying to figure out how things worked.
Yeah.
Though, a ton of it was just way over my head at the time. I was like, okay, sure, I'll just copy and paste this bit.
Yep. I
Right.
definitely remember going through that period of like not being able to understand the blog post, but grabbing the code out of the bottom and hoping it worked for whatever it was that I was working on.
Yeah, no, that is absolutely what sort of my formative experience was like, was just, well, okay, let's hope for the best. And the best did not come true a lot. And that's, how I ended up having to learn the stuff. It's like,
Yeah, totally. So, okay, cool. So you did that, which is pretty awesome. And then, so now you're kind of like next time back into tech. Was it starting at Two Wave? Was that like your first time doing it, or was it a little bit before then?
And actually working in tech, in terms of building things, Two Wave is really my first time. My last job, I worked at an academic publishing company, like I said, and they had this educational software project where, while I wasn't actually working on the software, I was working with the software team, and I had some really great sort of tech mentors there, who were good at helping me basically like become comfortable with tech, right? So like there's a sort of like inscrutable oh crap feeling to it, where you don't really know what you're doing, and it's kind of embarrassing to ask, right? Like, okay, you're in this room with a bunch of engineers, but like they're talking and you're just sitting there like, okay, eventually I'm going to get this. But the systems administrator, especially, this guy's name is Paul Ross. He was actually an incredible mentor for me, because he was really good at noticing when I was just completely clueless and filling me in later.
Uh-huh.
Right? So like he'd be like, okay, so here's the stuff that you didn't understand, right? And so that was tremendously helpful to me, to have a really supporting environment to just sort of teach me the principles. Like that was the first time I was really exposed to agile development, right? So they had a really regimented Scrum process. And I happened to sit next to the engineers. Oh, sorry about that.
Mhm.
Um, I happened to sit next to the engineers at that job, and so like the first couple of weeks, I'm sitting there like, why are they all standing up? But they taught me about Scrum. They taught me Jira and really like good bug documentation process. And then I was involved in prioritization pretty quickly, and just like, okay, well, here's the stuff that's driving your users crazy, right? Like, let's get these stories up to the top. And so, I mean, this is where I learned about stories and epics and spikes. And so, while I wasn't actually building this stuff, that's where I got a lot of my developmental framework from. Was just having a bunch of really good, friendly tech mentors.
Cool. Yeah, that's actually kind of, yeah, it's interesting. I think it's kind of like a unique approach with people that I've interviewed for this so far. Is like kind of cool coming from the like more like even QA product side, and then coming in that way. Like it's like you had a good grasp of Agile and Jira before you were really writing a lot of code. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's I mean, for me, it's probably what I needed, um, because well, I mean, I can, bash my head against code all I want. The sort of the structure and the familiarity, and the comfort that brought was really good for me. So, like personally, I have a really hard time when I don't understand something. Like it's really frustrating for me, and that can be sort of a blocker for myself, just like in actually learning something. And so, having an environment where everybody was totally fine with me not knowing what was going on, right? Like that was okay. Like, yeah, you're not a tech guy. You're doing this software stuff. Here's how it works. We're gonna help you. Like, we're not gonna be mad at you if you don't get it. We'll be happy to explain it for the thousandth time. So that was really important for me, is to have a sort of supporting
Yeah.
learning experience, um, and not an academic one. So I've done plenty of school, but having to do like tests on computer science, I think would have driven me insane. But to having a sort of like interpersonal support was very important for me in that job.
Yeah. Do you know what the stack was like there? Like what they were working with?
Yeah, it was a Ruby on Rails application, and it's still up actually. I think it's CG Scholar is what it's called. And that application, the engineers aren't there anymore, but the application is still going. And so it's just a big Ruby on Rails application,
Nice.
which yeah, it's a beautiful application, and it's the philosophy behind it. It's a writing education tool, and it's really cool in the way it's broken down. The person who founded the company, he's a sort of internationally renowned education scholar, and so the whole thing that they built, it's really great application, which unfortunately didn't quite find its market, thus the engineers not being there anymore. But was really fun to work on, and sort of neat to work on a that was like that's a sort of an application for the good of the world, right? Which is
Mhm.
also a pretty fun thing to be involved in.
Yeah, that always helps a lot for sure. Cool. All right. So then you go from there, and then you go to Two Wave, right? And you get kind of started just becoming your full time kind of career path.
Yeah, so I've never really done much of my career intentionally, um, which is not really something I would recommend. For those young listeners out there, there are parts of my career history that I would not really endorse as a good idea. But so I was working at my last job, and I was working a lot. I was getting really ground down. And My dad's company was growing pretty fast, and had gotten to the point where there was enough sort of bureaucratic nonsense that needed to be dealt with, bills and contracts and proposal writing and that sort of stuff that I'm really good at. I actually have a sort of business background. And so he poached me to do that. And I always like to, so when people hear that I work for my dad, well, it's actually like my fifth job. And it was only by about that point that he was willing to hire me. So it's not like a, oh, you need a job kind of situation. He really like, he wanted somebody who could do what I did, which was business stuff. But I ended up sort of expanding my experience at my last job, working with customers, or well, they're not customers so much, but working with the consumers of the product, which were kids a lot of the time, but also teachers. I got really good at sort of sussing out user requirements, and it gave me a background I didn't really know that I was accumulating, and sort of this sort of like user experience development design. So I ended up being really good, to everybody's surprise, including, I assure you, my own, at working with our customers at Two Wave to sort of figure out what they need and sketching it out and say like, well, is it this, right? Do these moving parts, is this what you need? And then handing that to the engineers and the developers. Um, and I get better at that all the time. Every time I do a set of wireframes now for the developers, there are less like, oh, what the hell are you talking about, Adrian moments. But it's been very organic for me, that whole process of coming over to do business and accidentally doing tech.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's interesting. It's cool. I find with a lot of people I've interviewed, it's like always one extreme or the other. Like people that are like, oh, I was 9 when I knew this was like software engineering was the thing for me. That was what I wanted to do. Or people that are like either really resistant or it never was, never intentional, never the plan, just kind of got like, organically drawn to it or, whatever it is kind of situation.
Yeah, when I was 9, I wanted to be a professional musician. So maybe not 9. By the time I was 10, I guarantee you I wanted to be a professional musician. I started playing cello right about then. And that's what I did. I mean, I had no career prospects or applicable college skills when I went to school other than music. I didn't even take math or science my senior year of high school because I was so focused on music. I'm practicing 6+ hours a day, right? Pardon me. Right. So, I mean, I started when I was 9 and I was like a very dedicated, diligent musician with like, that is what I was going to do when I was growing up. Now, nobody tells you that that is entirely hopeless, as a professional musician, which is unfortunate because a lot of people major in music. And I ended up basically just ruining myself. A combination of bad cello technique and probably some sort of inherited structural defects, but I just completely destroyed the upper right quadrant of my body. By the time I finished undergrad, I could barely handwrite almost anything. Just like my hand had stopped working and my neck and my back were coming along nicely. And so that threw me off the professional music train pretty hard. But like most failed musicians, I ended up in arts administration, which is a whole separate problem that I won't go in on. But so I ended up working for the local symphony here. Again, like, oops, right? No intentionality there. No, not a moment in my life had I spent preparing to be an arts administrator. I just happened to be a failed musician. So is this a good time to recap all the things that I've been bad at?
I mean, yeah, if you want to.
Okay, yeah. No, so it's so right. So I went from being a failed musician to being an arts administrator. I grew up. So I went to school at the University of Illinois. At least eventually, I started at Columbus State University, which is in it's the navel of the universe, down on the Alabama Georgia border, basically, right. I didn't like it there very much, so I ended up transferring back. So I had a huge network of just contacts in town, who managed to get me this job at the symphony, because they felt bad for me, right? Like, what do you do with a failed musician? So I was working at the symphony, and I liked it a lot. The parts that I liked about it, I was the operations manager there, so you sort of this is where I start to get in the business world. So I was doing a lot of this stuff, paying the bills, paying the musicians, running our mail campaigns. And so there is like, while the professional performing music world is pretty bleak, the arts administration world in some ways is a lot better career path for a lot of people. There are fewer arts administrators in it, and there are fewer talented ones. So the thing about music is that there are just, I mean, a staggering, incredibly depressing number of musicians who are better than you, no matter how good you are. I was at my last summer as a musician. So every summer you go to summer camp, right? My last summer I was at one of the best summer programs that there is. And I was there and I was just looking around. It's like, these people, like, there are 10-year-olds here who make me look like I'm a 10-year-old, right? And so to go from that to being an arts administrator, where the job market is actually pretty rich if you're good at it, but not for somebody who only had a music degree. You really need to have experience or education. So I started looking at what I liked about my job, which was working with musicians, sort of managing the mechanics of the orchestra, and what I could do for another degree that would be at all applicable, and looking around at sort of my options. So like there's an MBA, obviously, but that takes a long time, right? I could go to law school. A bunch of musicians go to law school, like really insane number of musicians go to law school because, they have some sort of applicable skills. Basically, if you can lock yourself in a concrete room for 6 hours a day for 10 years of your life, you can probably learn the law. But again, forever and very expensive. So I actually ended up settling on human resources. Um, for a number of reasons, but one of the main ones being that the program at the U of I is short, while also being one of the best. It's just 3 semester master's degree, in and out. And so I got in and I got a fellowship, which was great because I wasn't sure how I would pay for it otherwise. Um, and I got seduced pretty quickly by the corporate HR mystique that the program here focuses pretty heavily on corporate, and its graduates, like they start out making, I don't know, like I think now is the average of $80,000 a year or something, which to a engineer, especially on the West Coast, is not a lot of money, but for HR grads, it's just like criminally insane, especially considering you're in school for 3 semesters, right? And so, having grown up with not very much money, and having then been a musician, which is actually having even less money than when I was just mooching off my parents, right? That seemed very appealing to me, and so I got like pretty into the corporate mindset for about a semester and a half. And then I started burning out on the corporate mindset really hard. So this thing happens there where you have to get a summer internship. Have to being in quotation marks there. Right, that's how you get your next job. That's what you must do. And so they have companies coming in constantly, like every week. You can have interviews with companies. I had 25 or so interviews with companies, which like really spanning up to very large companies like Boeing and Honeywell. I interviewed with. It's like these really like huge companies, and the sort of consistent message from all of them was, Adrian seems very nice, but we have no idea how he would fit in our company. Uh, and so I listened, honestly, and like, all right, so that was like my first really serious taste of rejection, um, which really stung the first couple of times. But after failing about 25 times, uh, I sort of like, either I was going to get really depressed about myself and my abilities, or I was going to accept that if they don't want me, that's probably a sign that I don't belong there. Right, because my background, I had work experience that was applicable. Right, I've got great grades. I studied a lot of school. But I am not a quote unquote normal corporate employee, and I'm actually pretty lucky that those companies saw that, because I think that I would have been a pretty serious failure had I gone and tried to be in corporate HR work in manufacturing. Um, so, like I said, I sort of listened to that. I kept doing interviews. I got no summer internship offers. I got one second round interview with Boeing that didn't lead to an offer. And meanwhile, my friends are all getting, like, a bunch of them went to work for General Mills, for example. They're all going to these giant companies off for the summer, and I've got nothing. And I sort of accepted my fate at that point. Like, this was not for me, which is hard. It's hard to be like, well, I screwed this one up. Hey, dog. So that summer, I registered for some summer school classes, just mostly to keep my student loan money flowing. And I ended up actually back in music. I registered for a stats class over the summer, and I went and picked up the textbooks, and they were all like programming textbooks, like statistics application programming textbooks, which were not mentioned in the course overview at all. So I dropped that class as fast as I could, and managed to get myself into a film music class in the summer. And I was in film music class, like, oh yeah, I really like this, right? Like maybe I do want to do the music thing. And this is so again, through no real skill of my own except having a good network. Um, I got some really good contacts. So this is one of these bizarre things. So my great uncle was one of the people who recorded the Gilligan's Island theme song. So he knew a lot of people in the sort of the music world, and also in just like the, we're impressive professionals who are well networked world. And he hooked me up with a friend of his who was a judge, who was on the board of I even feel bad now. I think it was it was a major, one of the larger orchestras in Iowa. And he hooked me up with the dean of the Roosevelt music department, who's this guy named Henry Fogel, who is a really like legendary figure in the classical music world. So we're like at 3 degrees of separation now, but I went up and met him, and he was super nice and really provided me a lot of guidance on getting jobs. But he also agreed to be a reference for me, um, which uh, it's roughly equivalent to like having Steve Jobs as a reference, where just his name, which I had no right to, right? I just happened to know a guy who knew a guy who knew him and was able to get me a meeting with him. And this guy, I mean, he's incredibly kind. And I don't personally think that it was through any merit of my own that he decided to be nice to me. I listened well, right? I was respectful. We talked about my goals, but I wasn't particularly outstanding. Um, but his name got me, well, it opened a lot of doors for me. And so um, I ended up, so I just barely got a job by the time I finished grad school. So I got a job offer uh, for to go work for what bills itself as the nation's premier music festival and school, the Aspen Music Festival, which is in Aspen, Colorado. I got my job offer like a week before graduation, maybe actually less than that. I remember like I had just gotten my job offer when we were at graduation because I was telling people for the first time. So I mean, I really squeaked in under the wire on that one. And so I was hired to be the development assistant at Aspen. And so the interesting thing is, you're going to think, oh, like software development. Actually, the other kind of development, fundraising. Um, so that's something I had been involved with at my old job. Um, and I got to Aspen, and I can't tell you how incredibly expensive Aspen is. So okay, this is for those of you on the West Coast. This probably doesn't seem so awful, but so when I got there, the Wall Street Journal had just run an article about how Aspen was the most expensive place in the country to live, and the cheapest home for sale in Aspen was $900,000, and it was a trailer. I mean, like an honest to God trailer. Um, so our 600 square foot apartment, my wife and I and our 3 cats, um, pardon me, our 600 square foot apartment was almost $1,000 a month. And I was making under $40,000 there, and my wife didn't have a job. So we came in just like the feeling of being poor is luckily something I was pretty familiar with, but it's hard. It puts a lot of stress, put a lot of stress on my wife and I, and it put a lot of stress on me. And so there's sort of like this, it just felt bad. Um, And so I got to work. I started working, and I was there. I'll just skip to the chase. I was there for about 10 weeks before I got myself fired. The circumstances of which actually don't particularly matter. Like, they were perhaps not all my fault, but I definitely screwed up some things. I learned some very hard lessons at Aspen about being a functional adult, which I just wasn't quite ready for when I got there. And it sort of exposed a habitual disrespect for authority that I have, where just my boss and I, who's actually she's really great at her job, really nice woman, she and I did not really mesh well, which is 100% my fault. Like, um, so I got fired. And that was actually, I got fired the day before my birthday. So uh,
That's sad timing when it rains it
That's,
pours.
that's sort of, except that like when I got fired, I had this sort of overwhelming like wave of just right,
Yeah,
like okay, like this felt bad. It wasn't working. It's like there's no way I would never quit that job because it was a job, right? But I walked in the door to our apartment, and my wife looks at me. She's like, "Why are you here?" I said, "Do you want to move home?" Yes. So it was the day before my birthday. My dad actually flew into town the next day to celebrate my birthday with us. Um, he left, like I got fired on a Thursday. My birthday was Friday, and on Monday we were driving back to Champaign. Uh, so whoops. Like this is I don't know, depending on how you look at it, basically like my third failed career. Um, if depending if you count HR as being an actual failure or just an aborted launch. Uh, and I'm learning more about myself, which is weird. Like I'm at 25-ish at this point, right? I at 25 thought I should be an adult, and now at 31 I think, am I an adult yet? But so we got back to town, and again I got a job, not really through any merit of my own, except I had connections. So while I'm, hitting every single Craigslist and newspaper post for a job that there is, it just happens that a good friend of mine knows somebody at the company that they needed a part-time customer service person. Um, and that's what I got hired for. I got part-time customer service at a academic publishing company, um, which was, the literal any port in a storm. Um, Not something I ever considered doing. Like really not something I considered doing. But turns out this I actually was very good at. Um, so it was mostly email customer support and some phone. And I just am very fast at email. So I just churn through these email issues way faster than anybody that had ever hired before. And so uh, I was lucky enough that I sort of accumulated some more responsibility, and my boss ended up accumulating too much responsibility to be able to be in control of the customer service department. So I got promoted to running the customer service department, and then they added in my software component, which I mentioned before. So I sort of like just accumulated more and more stuff that I was responsible for. I ended up with my own team of people that I had hired and trained. I onshored our customer service team from India back to the US. So I did all these things that actually ended up being really terrific, formative career experiences that I had never intended to have. Right. Like I said, I've done very little in my life with intention. When I started this company, I was even still thinking I'd be in arts administration, and I got another arts administration job offer to work in Abilene, Texas. And I sort of looked at the job that I had, and I thought about being an arts administrator again. Like, actually, I'd rather do this. Which, if you'd asked me a month before, a week before, I think I would never have actually considered that. But I ended up, it was a really great crowd of people, and I was getting all these experiences that I found very fulfilling that I would never have guessed I would find fulfilling. I actually like talking to people on the phone for customer service, which is a bizarre trait, but served me really well. And so that's how I ended up at this academic publisher where, like I mentioned before, I just got all these technical skills sort of by osmosis and just by virtue of being lucky enough that somebody was willing to trust me to do some of those things. So yeah, I've essentially just been like a ship adrift on the tides of my own life.
Yeah, that's
And
interesting.
I'm really lucky to have a very tolerant wife on that particular front. She and I met in music school, and so she's had a sort of similar thing, but man, I dragged her all over the country. It's sort of like juked left and right as to what I was going to be doing professionally. And she's been very kind about that. And I've had, very supportive friends, a very supportive family, just in sort of like helping me become a grown up, which I don't know. I don't think I really turned into a decent functional adult until I was in my late 20s. Just like a very, very long maturing process for me, to the point where I would, in retrospect, even consider hiring myself. Right, younger me was a real pain for lots of reasons.
So, okay, I got a couple of questions.
Absolutely.
Looking back on, like different ways that your life could have, changed, and especially looking back on this life of being a corporate HR person for General Mills or something like that, do you look back with like a little bit of regret, like, oh, that would have been cool, or do you look back like, oh, thank goodness that didn't work out for me?
Well, like most things in life, it's a bit of both. Um, those sweet corporate HR salaries, right? And there's a lot to be said for that life. And I don't begrudge any of my colleagues from grad school who do that and are very happy in it and are very successful. So, the people that I went to school with now, they have rapidly climbed the ranks. They are all doing really cool, by corporate HR standards stuff, right? But it was not the life for me. A lot of them are getting moved across the country like they did rotations every 6 months. I had a friend of mine who went to Raytheon, which is a massive defense contractor, and the first 2 years of her employment, she had to move every 6 months. I that if I wasn't married or didn't mind just getting uprooted every 6 months, I guess that's reasonable. But it was not the life for me, the corporate HR life.
Yeah.
But I did, I learned a lot in grad school that I find remarkably useful at really random times. I mean, employment law has turned out to be really useful a lot, but even stuff like there's a big focus on stats there. It's really, that's a very important thing for HR people to understand is statistics. And so the grasp of statistics that I got there has turned out to be useful in occasions where you'd never think. Like I applied it to donor databases, to donor retention and donor giving rates in ways that my employers had never seen before. Like I said, employment law has been very useful both for myself and for many of my friends who've been in somewhat less than legal arrangements from time to time. I had a friend who, when she was leaving her job, they tried not to give her vacation payout. I said, well, no, that's not legal. Hey, let's, I can prove it. Here's the Illinois statute, right? But not just employment law, but sort of facility with law. Right, like the ability to read contracts, right? To actually read a contract and understand what it says. Well, that's been really useful since, like when we work with the state, for example, the state of Illinois sends us a 40-page contract. It's like the University of Illinois by way of the state of Illinois, or the University of Illinois by way of the state of Illinois by way of a community college in Southern Illinois, back to us, right? So that's a contract. That's a program where we had sort of 3 contracts that we had to deal with, and just my ability to deal with that, I would never have had before I went to grad school. So while corporate HR was not for me, like the skills that I learned there were applicable everywhere. I took a staffing class there, which has made me way better at hiring employees than anybody who hasn't taken a staffing class. Which that's going to be true for most people, for most things, as long as they let it. And I'll be honest, like the fact that I picked up skills in grad school was, despite my best efforts in some ways. Like I was really burnt out on it, especially my last semester. I was like, oh, this is just like, I'm not doing this. I really don't like this atmosphere. I don't want to do these things. I'm feeling really depressed. Like I just go to class and phone it in. I wish I hadn't done that. There's a regret for you. Like I should have, if I had worked harder in grad school, I would have been better off, despite whatever success I happen to have. Arts administration I don't miss at all. The idea of begging for my own paycheck for the rest of my life is sad, and the arts world is just collapsing. There will still be major orchestras, but every year they make less and less money, except for the really big ones. So I wouldn't say there are really any actual regrets about the path that I've ended up on, which I don't think I'm even allowed to say chose, right? Other than making a couple of choices here and there. I guess I chose not to take a job in Texas. But mostly I have lucked into everything I've got, which is it's sort of weird, to be like, well, no, I don't know that I deserve any of this, but it's where I am. And it's made me really happy. So
yeah,
I think that's good.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I think that one thing that I hear a lot of is that there's like this certain kind of perspective that, like unrelated experience or whatever, like, oh, I wasted time doing X when then I ended up doing Y or whatever. But I think it's like really interesting that, if you're the right kind of person, you stay positive about things, like really no experience is bad experience. Like you learn all this cool stuff and it gives you like, in like, so, there's like this alternate universe, right, where you like knew what you wanted to do, which was this, like 10 years ago. And this is like, you had 5 jobs doing the same thing and you get really good at, like development and contracts or whatever. But then there's this other world where you have like all these unique perspectives and all these unique skills that you can bring that, what I mean, that other people can't, because you had all these, different experiences. I think there's like a lot of value in that. And I think that's like underappreciated a lot of the time. People that come from totally different worlds, totally different fields can really bring a lot of skills that you just, and maybe as an employer weren't even aware you needed or could be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what happened for me at my previous job, is that I was able to do a whole bunch of stuff that they had no idea about. Like I had a master's degree and I was applying for a part-time job. basically had to beg them for it. The only reason I got it again is because I had a friend who said like, no, really, it's not like he's just going to go wander off. Like there is no job market now. He really needs a part-time job. You can hire him. It's safe.
Yeah.
And then I got to apply my skills, but that's not what I was hired for, right?
Right.
And I am lucky in that regard that I learned a bunch of different things because it sort of lets me be a kind of jack of all trades, right? And so now in my job at 2Wave, where I can do, most things, at least somewhat successfully, especially once I get on Google, um, it has really benefited me. But there are times when like, well, if I had spent a little more time throughout my life just learning about computers, right, I'd be a lot more facile with them. It probably would not have cost me much with my other hobbies, but I didn't, and it's worked out okay. I'm not going to be some super successful front end engineer or super successful, world traveling consultant. That's not the life that I've ended up with. Uh, but that's okay. Like that kind of failure, if it could even be deemed a failure, right? That's compared to all the things that I've actually really like screwed up. I think I've ended up in a tremendously lucky place.
Yeah. Yeah, it's cool too because I think that, for me starting this podcast, a lot of it was like talking about like wanting to talk to people in a more like humanizing way and talk about rejection and talk about the fact that, we all face it. And, I think you get this like perspective based on conference talks and blog posts and things like that there's these like other people that are like wildly successful and never face failure, and you know what I mean, they're just brilliant. And I'm sure there are people like that, but I think for the rest of us, like that blog post or conference talk is just, that's us shining, that's like one moment where we're like looking really really good. But I think like the reality is that the stuff that we don't talk about is like what it's like being fired, or like, you know what I mean, what it's like how to push through that stuff, because we really do all face it, and it's really hard to push through.
Yeah, it's true. It's really hard. So when I was in grad school, I worked in the career center, and having moved back to town, I actually spend some time mentoring now when I can. And given my HR background, actually, I have a website about job hunting, which does not get a lot of traffic, but people run into it, and friends of mine send their friends. And so I spend a lot of time coaching either students or friends of mine or mutual friends of mine, right? Just helping them, get through the whole process of even finding a job, making a resume that gets parsed correctly by the stupid algorithm that whatever employer is using, right? Making a cover letter that stands out among a sea of worthless cover letters because cover letters have very little predictive value, right? And then actually getting into the interview, right? Where the interview is most interviews are a complete farce, right? Most interviews are actually decided in the first couple of minutes, and it's almost entirely whether the person who's interviewing you likes you or not.
Yep.
Right. And so having like teaching people all of that and exposing all of the things that aren't what they look like, right? Like, oh, you think that you're actually interviewing with somebody, but really you're just auditioning to see if they like you, right? And then helping people prepare for failure, right? Like the odds are that any given interview, you're not going to get this job, right? You're going to send out 100 applications and you're going to get back, if you get back 10 responses, 10 interviews, you're in great shape. And it's something we're not very well prepared for, is just like not actually getting what you want.
Yep.
Or just finding out you're not good enough, which that is something I'm very glad for music for. So, your entire life in music is just a string of auditions, right? One audition after the other, audition, audition, audition. And by the way, audition, failure, audition, failure, audition, failure, right? You apply to a bunch of different music schools, you only get into one or two, or you get into a couple and you don't get enough scholarship money, you don't get orchestra jobs. So musicians actually spend a lot of time failing. They don't deal with it very well. So the music world is actually sort of emotionally toxic, especially the sort of the medium levels of musicians. They spend a lot of time not doing well and not processing it well. But once you've sort of experienced that failure chain enough, you can kind of wrap your head around it. And like I said, then I didn't get 25 or so jobs for internships. But when I talk to people and I'm working with them, it's something I have to say, like this is not going to work out. This thing you're trying probably not going to work out. But every time that you go for it and you fail, you're more likely for the next one, right? You build this whole suite of skills. Interviewing is it's a game, right? And you build tricks, right? Like you
Yep.
build interviewing tricks. I teach people to interview, and almost nothing that I teach people is about like how to showcase themselves or something, right? It's just a set of things that you do so that, and I hate to say this, but most of the time you are just working to manipulate the person that's interviewing you,
Yep.
right? I
Yeah,
mean,
there's been a lot of interesting research. I think you really hit it where like I can't remember what the number was, but it was like most people have decided pass or fail on you in the first. I think it was like under a minute, like really like you're,
yeah.
like
So there's an initial impression that comes under a minute, right? Almost
mhm,
immediately. When you meet somebody, they will look at you, and if you look like them,
right.
uh, you got this major leg up, right? There's a sort of this immediate assessment that like, do you move in the same ways that they do, right? There's a whole set of subconscious things that happen that gives you an initial assessment, and then yeah, the hiring decision is made. I think I would have to find my notes on it, but
Yeah.
it's like 3 to 4 minutes where most hiring managers have already decided if they're going to hire you or not, and then you have, I don't know, depends on how long the interview is, another 12 minutes, another 57 minutes to try to talk them out of whatever decision they've made.
Right.
Or if you happen to have been lucky enough to have impressed them in that way, right, to then don't screw it up. But the majority of the time, you are just trying to make sure that you fit into the mental model slot that they have for who they're supposed to be hiring, which has not been exposed to you, right? Which gives people that look like me a big leg up because a white guy meets another white guy and you get this huge affinity, right? And so now you've got this advantage. And so I actually spend a lot of time working with people who are not white men. I will work with anybody who needs my help. I work with, but the people who I really try to focus on are the people who don't have a sort of built-in leg up on the world,
Right.
because the sort of, well, it is a game, and so the hoops that each different kind of sort of marginalized group has to jump to is a little different, um, and that's sucks. I mean, it makes me really mad all the time, but it's the truth, and I would love to live in a world where it doesn't. But the people that I work with, I'm instead teaching them like, well, here are a bunch of ways to manipulate the person that you're working with, that you're talking to, into liking you,
Right.
right? Like, watch how they move and move like them. Look them in the eye, lean a little forward, take notes, right?
Mhm. No, yeah, I think it's definitely something that we've talked about a lot on this show. It's like a very unfortunate reality, but I mean, it is a lot. There's, being out on the West Coast where it's a huge problem, a huge obvious problem. The only kind of cool things that I've seen, some companies are really pushing forward with it, but during my time at Twitter, we've had a lot of subconscious bias training, which we still I mean, our numbers are still horrible as far as underrepresented minorities go, but it is, it's important and it's cool. It's great to help people that are going out for interviews. I think it's also really important as, if you're a owner of a big company and you can swing it to get people, there are experts that you can have come in and help you, on the other side of the table, help you not be contributing to such a bad problem. But
Right.
yeah,
And
it's tough.
I actually offer that consulting service too. I don't do that one for free, but like, since I have an HR background, I do offer consulting services about selection, right? Sort of trying to teach people, and it is selection, right? The whole process. It starts so far before the interview that it's like
Right.
comical, right? It starts with your job posting. I mean, it starts with how you take applications, right? If the people who are selecting interviewees ever see their names, then anybody with a name that isn't quote unquote white,
Right.
right, has just like a stupid disadvantage, to the point where when I work with people who don't have a really like statistically normal name, I frequently say like, well, have you considered using initials? Right. And if it's, women, like almost every woman that I work with, I suggest like, well, there is tangible value to not having your name on your resume, to using your initials. Right. And I mean, you start from there. And so, yeah, companies really underestimate how hard it is to not be bad. Right. It's very hard work to not be bad at hiring people.
Yep.
Um, at every step from screening resumes to actual interviews to technical interviews are an entirely different, pardon me again, an entirely different can of worms, which are very hard. And for a lot of reasons, it's very hard to do a good technical interview that's predictive. Um, so like that's a service that I offer. It's hard to get people to buy in, right, to the fact that they might be bad at what they're doing.
Right.
And so it's good, when big companies get sort of mud slung at them, right? When they get shamed in public, it really has, and I'm sorry for the people who get shamed in public on it, but it has actually a pretty positive net effect because a lot of the smaller companies, they see that, and it's not all of them or even most of them, but smaller companies will see that and they'll see like, okay, well, we should be better,
Yeah.
right? And so that's something, that's a service that I like to provide. Coaching people, here are the 25 different ways that you're probably biased against or for the people that you're interviewing,
Hmm.
right? So it's hard. It's really, really hard.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is. I think it's really important too. So yeah, it's cool. So I think we're running pretty close on time. We covered a lot of really good stuff. Do you have any kind of like last bits of advice, people, just starting off their careers right now, or maybe in school, things like that, things that you would like to bestow?
Yeah, sure. I don't have like a list prepared here,
No, no, yeah.
but so the number one thing that distinguishes successful employees from mediocre employees is Google. I'm not kidding. The number one skill that you can have as a young person going to the workplace is the ability to figure out the problem for yourself. So, and it's been tremendously successful in my life. Like the ability to be like, this seems wrong, and I bet that somebody on the internet has found a better way to do it. Right? Just doing that, just not having to, well, one, not having to go for help for everything. Um, and two, being able to actually present a solution, right? Those can make tremendous impacts in your professional career. But don't be a pain in the ass about it. And this is the mistake that I made. Um, I don't think I'm nearly as smart as I did when I was younger, but when I was younger, I was very sure of how smart I was. Um, and I certainly ruffled some feathers that I shouldn't have ruffled by not just shutting up, right? There is a point where even though you may in fact be smarter than the person that you're talking to, your solution may in fact be better than their solution. Um, it's really important to realize when you should just not either don't fight it at all or surrender. I'm very bad at both of those, and I continue to be bad at them as an adult, quote unquote adult. But when I was younger, I was worse, and that's certainly got me fired, and certainly ruffled many feathers in my life where I wouldn't just be like, okay, I understand this is dumb, but well, don't say that, but internally it's like this is dumb, but it is not. I can't win this fight, or even if I won this fight, it would be detrimental. Because point three that I'll make is that office politics are a very real thing. Um, and if you are a person who says, I'm just not going to deal with office politics, I'm not going to deal with that, emotional stuff, you are going to get run out of town so hard. We are no longer in a world where you can be, just somebody who works on their computer. You have to be empathetic with your coworkers. You have to be empathetic with your customers. You have to learn, if you don't have them already, learn the skills to realize what your interactions with people are conveying, and to learn to pick up if you haven't learned already what the social cues look like when people are mad at you, right? Or when you're pushing too hard, like start learning them now, because emotional intelligence, while being a quote unquote soft skill, it's stupid. Right. And so many of these things have not been valued because they've been linked to women, and women are historically undervalued, but they are not women's skills. And if you think that they are women's skills, then you are very, very wrong. So you have to, as much as you have any technical skill, you have to have the emotional intelligence to be not only just a good coworker, but also just a good person in the workplace. It's becoming more and more valued and less acceptable to be an asshole. Um, if I had to offer just a little bit of advice, it would be those things. Like, I go study your engineering, right? Be a great engineer, but remember that there are sort of like a set of things that have very little to do with what you've learned, but a lot to do with who you are and how you approach problems that are going to be much more important for you in whatever you do.
Yeah. Oh, cool. I think that's great. I think that's a really good note to end on. Cool. Well, thanks so much for being on the show. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. This was lots of fun. So I look forward to hearing it air so I can be embarrassed at my own voice. But
Oh, yes, that is a reality I deal with every single week.
yeah, I think actually I really enjoy the show. I've listened to a bunch of episodes now. I think it's a really cool concept, and I'm really glad that you're doing it. So
Cool. Thank you so much. And yeah, awesome. Thanks again.
great. Yeah, thanks. Good to talk to you.
Too.